I was born in Launceston in Tasmania, and I grew up just outside of Launceston, Kaina. I had a cousin who's a warrant officer in the army, and a cousin who was in the Air Force. But other than that, no one that I was aware of at the time had served. I went to Brooks High School in Launceston and decided at the age of 16 that I wanted to travel the world and get out of Tasmania. Originally joined up as an aircraft technician. Got accepted. By that time I was 17. Was going to go off to recruit school, but I changed my mind and decided to move to Victoria and do Year 12, repeat Year 12, because I was going to join as a seaman officer. I think they're called maritime officers now. They are in charge of the ship under the commanding officer. So they make all the decisions when on the bridge, all the movements that the ship makes. But I'd heard bad things about being a seaman officer. So I chose boatswain's mate. A boatswain's mate is a seamanship expert. Anything to do with ropes is what a boatswain's mate does. They are the small arms experts on board the ship. So anything ranging from a pistol to 50 cal machine gun. Their job is to know how they work inside and out. And I waited 18 months to get in because they weren't recruiting females at the time and there was no positions available. I went to recruit school at Cerberus, HMAS Cerberus in Hastings in Victoria. So that's the initial training for the Navy for all non-commissioned ranks. There was bets on in my family that I would not make it through recruit school because I didn't like discipline and I certainly didn't like to be told what to do. I think my grandfather had a bet on that I would last 2 weeks in recruit school. But I thought it was quite easy, recruit school. You just did what you were told and got up early and went for a run. I enjoyed it. And then after recruit school, I went on to my category training. Category training is where you learn to do every part of your job. So for us, we spent 4 weeks in seamanship school, learning how to tie knots and do jack stays, anything to do with rope work, throw heaving lines. And then we went on to weapons training. So we had to know every weapon. I think there's about 7 weapons, every weapon, and how to use them. Pull them apart and put them back together and fire them within a certain amount of time. So that's the fun part for most people. So we were down at the range doing that. And then we went on to parade training because as you move up in the ranks of a boatswain's mate, you're the parade commander. When you get to chief, you're the parade commander and in charge of everybody marching. Our class was about 12 people when we went to category training, and we all helped each other because you didn't want one of your mates not to pass the course and the others to get through. So if someone was lacking on something that you were good at, you helped them out, and that's just what you did. I left Cerberus in August 2006, and my first posting, I briefly went to FSU in Sydney, which is Fleet Support Unit. It used to be called FEMA back then. And then it was there for a week and then headed on to Kanimbla. There was 2 of us from our class that went, so we had backup, I guess. And we joined just after they had been to Timor and then home for a bit, and we joined in the August. It's a humanitarian vessel, and it was one of the biggest at the time in the Australian fleet, so I was just excited to get aboard a ship, and some of our classmates had to wait before they could go to sea, so I was ready to go and start doing what I was trained to do. And when we went on board, it was just, I guess it was a bit overwhelming. It was massive. I think it was about 230, but could carry up to 1,000 troops. So it had its own troops messes and accommodation spaces. Late September, we were deployed to Quickstep, which was when the coup was happening in Fiji. So we had 8 hours notice to go back to Townsville, load the ship up and head off to Fiji. I guess at the time that was a little bit scary for me. I didn't expect to be deployed so quickly, and none of us really knew what was going on. We couldn't tell people where we're going, but I happened to call my mum and she told me it was all over the news, so she told me where I was going. We had the Army, SAS and commandos were on board. We had a complement of Black Hawks and lots of army vessels in case we had to get Australians out of Fiji. When we were there just purely in case something happened to go in. So once we got to see Fiji, the land, that was it. The rest of the time was just floating back and forth in international waters. And then the army were doing exercises with the Black Hawks, and one of them crashed on the deck. So our job was then, because it hit the deck and then went over, our job was then to obviously get in the wounded people and recover those who didn't make it. When they made the initial pipe, we didn't realise that it had happened, because obviously you practice those events. And then suddenly you realise that a Black Hawk has gone into the water. So you go to your emergency stations, you do what you're trained to do. It sort of just kicks in, I guess. At that time, it kicked in and we did what we needed to do. Later on, it was very quiet. To have, 600-700 people on board a ship, not many people spoke to each other. It was just, I think we were just all numb. I was in the sick bay when it happened, suffered from dehydration. I was meant to be in the boat because they had ribs out as part of the exercise, and I was meant to be in the boat. And I'm, in one way, very glad I wasn't. After that initial time, obviously getting in the debris and the survivors, and then we had to stay and search for the bodies in case they came up. But they were still in the helicopter. So, and the waters being so deep over there, they weren't recovered until months later. Leaving Kanimbla was my choice. I wanted to go to a warship where things happen, a little bit more exciting, and you get to leave Australian waters. So it was my choice to go to Darwin. My buffer on board Kanimbla helped me get the posting. And yeah, I joined in, I think it was about March 2008, but I was only there for 3 months. I had injured myself on board Kanimbla, playing volleyball of all things. I had an army guy land on my foot, and the pain had been there, but obviously I didn't want to leave the ship. Wanted to stay at sea. And once I hit Darwin, I couldn't cope with the pain anymore, so I had to go to the doctor. Once it was deemed that I needed surgery, I had to be posted ashore so that I could get the time to rehabilitate. When you're mech'd, medically taken or removed from a ship, Penguin is generally the base you go to because it's the hospital base, and they have TPMC, or now called PSU, where all the injured people go, and then you're sent out to do other jobs where they just need temp. The chief bosun there was my buffer on Kanimbla, so he got me over there. So I was working command ceremonial, so I got to do a lot of events and parades, so I really enjoyed that. But then after, once I had the surgery, it was very frustrating because there wasn't a great deal that I could do. And I wasn't sure whether I was going to stay in the Navy because of my injury. I had 3 surgeries, and each time I had a surgery, you go to the mech review board, so I had to prove why I should stay in the Navy. So I kept fighting that, and then after my 3rd surgery, they wanted to kick me out, and I fought to go back to sea because that's where I wanted to be. And I had a plan when I joined the Navy to stay in until I was a petty officer, or for the rest of my life. So I was going to do it no matter what happened. My next posting was to HMAS Melbourne. So before that, I headed down to Cerberus to do the safety equipment and maintainer course, so the SE on board the ship, and that went for about 9 weeks. So learning everything to do with life jackets, life rafts, thermal protective suits, industrial sewing course, so that I could fix the life jackets and make awnings and all sorts of things. And then I got on to Melbourne, and that was my job whilst I was still a bosun. My other job was the safety equipment maintainer, so there was myself and a leading seaman to look after all the life jackets on board the ship. HMAS Melbourne, like Darwin, is an FFG, so a frigate and a warship, as we like to call them. And it's a much smaller ship with about a crew of 220 people. And I guess a very different mentality from Kanimbla. Kanimbla was very relaxed, whereas a warship, everything is done for a reason, and there's much more emphasis around weapons and going to war and training to be at war. Whilst you know you're going to a war or a war zone, it wasn't in my head until we did the briefs beforehand, where you get the, if you have to shoot someone, could you do it? Talks. And that's when it sort of started to sink in. I guess mentally you can't really prepare until you're there and you know what it's like. People can tell you what it's going to be like, but you could have a different deployment to the last ship that went and to the one that's going to follow you. So it's not until you're there or on the way there that you start to think about those sort of things. We were there for about 5 months all up in the waters. For our deployment, it was relatively quiet, whereas for other ships, like Warramunga's there now and they've had a very busy deployment. So it's very mind-numbing because you're doing the same thing all the time. So we would still we'd have like DC Tuesday, so practicing fire, flood, torpedo attack, but most of your days were just spent on watch doing the same thing that you did yesterday. My commanding officer's commendation was for my job as the survival equipment maintainer. So when I first joined the ship, the life jackets had not been maintained very well. So I had to service every single life jacket on board, and my leading seaman was on course. And then once we sailed for the deployment, his daughter was born. So he stayed back in Australia and joined us a month and a half later. So I was the only person looking after the survival equipment whilst still doing my watches on the GDP. So I would, in my off hours, so some days you'd do, well, most of the time you'd do like 7 hours on, 5 hours off. So in my time off, I was working whilst everyone else was sleeping and going to the gym. We were all pretty keen to come home after the trip. 6.5 months in a small space. People tend to get on your nerves, which is normal. So coming home was very exciting, to have your families on the wharf when you get into Sydney. Seeing Sydney Harbour first thing in the morning is amazing when you've been away after a long deployment. One of the best views ever. But then when you come back, you get that initial, for me personally anyway, you get that initial feeling of, yay, we're home. But then I moved up to Cairns, and it's a very quiet base. I was ashore, and you went from, being vigilant and on the go all the time to nothing. So I personally didn't cope very well with that, because I was posted to port services, so we were just berthing and slipping the ships that were coming in up in Cairns, and Cairns is not a very busy base. So most of the time sitting around in a workshop. So it was you just went from doing everything to nothing, which is not very good for the mind. I was ashore for 1.5 years at port services, and then I decided to have a family. So once I got pregnant with my son, obviously I'm then shifted from place to place whilst I'm pregnant. So I worked in the medical centre there, and then once I had my son, I was on maternity leave. And then my partner was posted from Cairns to Sydney with 4 weeks' notice. We couldn't get daycare in Sydney, so I chose to leave the Navy at a very, very short notice. But I had injured my back whilst we were on the way to the Middle East in 2012, and I wasn't able to do a great deal. Anyway, all the requirements, can't lift more than 10 kilos, so I couldn't lift an Okabar set to fight fires. So had I not chosen to get out, I would have been medically discharged. It's a very lonely world, I guess, on the outside. So obviously you have lots of friends, workmates in the Navy and on the base, but once you leave, it's like you're just cut off from the world. So we moved to Sydney, which we know a lot of people in Sydney, but they have their own lives on the ship and with their own families now, so I can't say we've caught up with any of the friends that we have here. I don't march on Anzac Day. I have not really a hatred for Anzac Day, but this year I was asked 3 times if they were my husband's medals. And I have been every year. I've been refused to an RSL when I was wearing my medals, yet my partner and friends got in because they were wearing uniform. So I still go to Anzac Day marches and services, but I guess I don't like them. I don't like being asked if I'm, whose medals am I wearing? But my time in the Navy, I loved it. I got to see all of Australia, travelled to every state in Australia. I got to see places in the Middle East that you would not pay to go, but the people were amazing, the scenery amazing, and it's a time that I'll never forget. If I had my time again, I'd do it again. Probably do some things differently, but it's a great career. It's a great start in life. I came from Tassie, where had I stayed there, I would have worked with my parents at the vineyard that I grew up on. But instead I got to experience so many different people, so many different places.